So I would like to introduce you to some key elements of migration and gender. My presentation has basically two parts. One will be on gender. It's about engendering objects, about what is gender, sex and gender, the gender order, and beyond the binary. The second part will be on migration and gender. Is there a feminization of migration? What are feminist migration studies? What are key topics in feminist migration studies? And last but not least, the question of queering migration studies. Then there'll be a brief summary, and in the end, you will find some of the references. Let me start with this idea, this question of engendering objects. How is gender inscribed into the following images that I'm going to show you in a quick sequence? There is a quote from a blog about what you just saw. His and hers door knockers in Yazd, Iran. The masculine door knocker is rigid and heavy, that makes a strong sound. People inside the house will be informed that a man is behind the door. The feminine door knocker is curly and ring-like and makes a lighter sound. It informs the people inside the house that a woman is behind the door. This system is in place due to the Islamic custom that women should be private from men, except their intimate ones. So, in other words, the circular or female, respectively the rectangular, in inverted commas, male door knockers produce a different sound, so that people inside the house know if it is a man or a woman knocking on the door. This will lead to different actions. If a woman is knocking, a woman or girl might open the door. If a man is knocking, a woman might still open the door, but will make sure to be properly veiled, or women just retreat into the women's part of the house. These door knockers are an example how gender is inscribed in architectural detail or fittings. And this is not a specialty of Oriental or Muslim culture. Have a look. In what way is gender inscribed into the following images? In English, electrical equipment, connectors, sockets, plugs is gendered. Let's move now from English and technology to German and geography. What about gender with regard to the following images? So you've had just a look at die Ems and die Donau and der Rhein and der Mississippi. While in English rivers are not gendered, in German they are. Most are female. Die Ems, die Donau, die Weser, die Elbe, some male, der Rhein, der Mississippi, der Amazonas, der Main. And it is not only that objects may be gendered in one language and not so much in another. The assignment of gender at times shifts from one language to another, from one culture to another. Here's an example from astronomy. In German, it's die Sonne, so it's female. In French, le soleil is male. In German, der Mond is male. In French, la lune is female. So now let's get more serious. What is gender? We are surrounded by gender law from the time we are very small. It is ever present in conversation, humor, and conflict, and it is called upon to explain everything from driving styles to food preferences. Gender is embedded so thoroughly in our institutions, our actions, our beliefs, and our desires that it appears to us to be completely natural. The world swarms with ideas about gender, and these ideas are so commonplace that we take it for granted that they are true, accepting common adage as scientific fact. As scholars and researchers, though, it is our job to look beyond what appears to be common sense, to find not simply what truth might be behind it, but how it came to be common sense. So, what the earlier examples illustrate, gender is ever present in almost any culture, but the assignations and meanings shift as gender is socially and culturally constructed. And then there is the important distinction, sex and gender. To put it briefly, sex is a biological categorization based primarily on reproductive potential, whereas gender is the social elaboration of biological sex. But while we think of sex as biological and gender as social, this distinction is not clear-cut. Thus, the very definition of the biological categories male and female, and people's understanding of themselves and others as male or female, is ultimately social. To whatever extent gender may be related to biology, it does not flow naturally and directly from our bodies. The individual's chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics do not determine occupation, gait, or use of color terminology. Gender is the very process of creating dichotomy by effacing similarity and elaborating on difference. And where there are biological differences, these differences are exaggerated and extended in the service of constructing gender. Just for a minute, let's go back to the doors of Yast. The blogger said, the masculine door knocker is rigid and heavy, that makes a strong sound. The feminine door knocker is curly and ring-like and makes a lighter sound. Is the author projecting his understanding of masculinity and femininity by evoking and gendering the sounds he expects the door knockers to make? The gender order. The gender order is based in the binary construction of masculinity and femininity, just as we have seen with the door knockers. The making of a man or a woman is a never-ending process that begins before birth. Gender is not something we have, but something we do. Gender is asymmetrical. Inequality is built into gender at a very basic level. The gender order is a system of allocation based on sex-class assignment of rights and obligations, freedoms and constraints, limits and possibilities, power and subordination. Beyond the binary. Although there is a general dominance of heterosexuality and heteronormativity in our everyday life, as in our thinking, this has been challenged and increasingly so. Queer theory, queer thinking as an anti-normative signifier, as well as a social category, is nowadays a very relevant and a very present discursive element. With this comes a variety of sexual identity categories and practices. Just for example, LGBTQI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex. So if this was a tour d'horizon of gender and in a way of gender studies, I would like now to switch to some thoughts about migration and gender. Migration, as all social processes, is a gendered process. All topics in migration studies have gender dimensions. And still, all too often, these are not addressed or explored. Partly because of this, there is the big question, is there a feminization of migration? The still dominant perspective is women migrants are either perceived as dependent family members or victims of trafficking. and the typical refugee seems to be a young man. If we address this from a statistical perspective, just for a minute, the United Nations Population Division in 2000 estimated that 49% of all international migrants were women and girls. The UNHCR estimates that women and girls make up around 50% of any refugee, internally displaced, or stateless population. So it's safe to say that when we look at it from a global perspective, the gender of migration processes is quite balanced. This might be the result of a historical process in the 20th century, but if we look back at earlier migration processes, we also have to ask the question if an evaluation that these were male-dominated is not just a result of researchers focusing on male migrants and ignoring women migrants. For some decades now, we do have feminist migration studies. This is not necessarily linked to a feminization of migration, but it is primarily an epistemic question. So migration studies did not address gender until the 1980s, and this only changed with feminist migration studies. Feminist migration studies explore gender dimensions of migratory processes and migrants' lived experiences from historical as well as contemporary perspectives. Feminist migration studies very frequently operate along intersectional perspectives, which means they also look at race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation. Feminist migration studies explore the dynamics of gender relations in migration contexts, and they are very much into developing theory and methods in order to further explore the gender dimensions of migration. Some of the key topics in feminist migration studies are women, refugees, and asylum seekers. This is then linked to gender-based and gender-related prosecution. It is linked to the exploration of the continuum of violence before, during, and after seeking refuge. It is asking about participation and rights in refugee camps and host societies. And feminist migration studies, not least, also explore masculinities and migration. Further topics are sex work and trafficking. This is a global issue and a very contested area of research. And the global chain of care is another dimension of feminist migration studies. This is linked to the observation that in many highly industrialized countries, women move into the labor market, and the tasks that women had at home are not filled or shared with the men in the respective societies, but migrant women move in performing these tasks and having to leave behind their children, but also other relatives who might have needed their care. And then these tasks, again, are either taken over by these women's relatives or another group of migrant women, often internal migrants who move from rural areas to urban areas to fill in for the women who moved internationally or transcontinentally. So this global chain of care is also one of the key topics in feminist migration studies. Another dimension of recent development in gender and migration is the queering of migration studies. This is expressly going beyond the binary of femininity, masculinity, male and female, men and women. It is addressing the situation of LGBTQI queer in the country of emigration, in the migration process, and in the country of immigration. And it is, just as feminist migration studies, also very much related to theorizing, to questions of power, knowledge, and identities. So to summarize, gender and migration is not limited to research about migrant women. It addresses all genders and sexualities. It is non-binary, non-essentializing. It is about critique of all gender orders and gender inequalities, and it understands gender as a dimension of power relations. Thank you. So,